Hello, this is Eric Miskell with EMSNOW, and I am here with David Schild, Executive Director of the Printed Circuit Board Association of America once again. David, it's been just a couple months since we last talked, but I feel like so much has happened since then.
Yeah, no shortage of activity on industrial policy, congressional action, supply chain interruptions. There's certainly a lot to cover.
Yeah, let's start with the news. You and I were chatting here before we started. There's a couple of news things, to put a date stamp on it. Today is the first day of the longshoremen strike, right? So people will know when we're actually speaking. And then there was also the news out of TTM. I mean, somewhat
Yeah,
unrelated, but yet related, right? So
Eric, another day, another example of the fragility of global supply chains. Yeah, here it is, October. The leaves are starting to fall. They're putting pumpkin spice in my coffee, and the longshoreman strike, right? Which is not something to joke about by any means. I think we're going to see some significant disruptions, but of course, 50,000 longshoremen unable to come to an agreement on their collective bargaining, and of course, real implications for ports all along the Gulf and East Coast in terms of shutdowns. But as you and I were discussing, this is just the latest interruption to global supply chains, and it foot stomps the need for secure and resilient chains that stretch not just overseas, but down the road into domestic capacity. And you say, okay, well, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. We had all sorts of blockages of canals. We had bridges falling into the river in Baltimore. We had attacks on ships at sea in the Middle East. Now we have a labor dispute shutting down the ports in the United States. It isn't a matter of if, it is a matter of when these supply chain interruptions are going to continue. And so a reliance on overseas manufacturing for critical microelectronics, it just doesn't make sense because you can't prevent all of these interruptions and disruptions, but you can make some of what we need, not all of what we need, here in the United States. And I think that would be a game changer. That's the reason PCBAA was formed 3 years ago.
yeah, no, exactly right. And and that's interesting too, because a lot of those boards that are being shipped are by sea. You're going to have added costs to try to get them here by air on an expedited basis, which just kind of drives up the costs and underscores the point that you're making. Having them here locally would be that much more beneficial for the industry.
And it's, of course, where we used to be, right? We go back 3 decades and we had 2,200 companies. We were making 30% of the world's PCBs. Like many products, that work was pushed offshore. Like many sectors, that work went to Asia. But now we have what I would describe as a dependency. Certainly, if 6 out of 10 boards come out of mainland China, if almost 9 out of 10 boards are coming out of Asia writ large, that's very close to a dependency on things that have to travel across the Pacific Ocean. Any number of disruptions, as we've talked about, can affect that supply chain. Why not do what we're doing with semiconductors? Why not establish a secure and resilient and robust domestic manufacturing base? I think it just makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely does. I want to come back to that point in a minute. Let's finish the other news point too today. The TTM award that TTM just got.
Yeah, really exciting news that the Department of Defense, under the Defense Production Act investment account, has awarded $30 million to TTM, one of our founding members, to expand their capacity to produce ultra-high density interconnect printed circuit boards. This will help them build out a brand new 200,000 square foot facility in Syracuse, New York. Of course, TTM's all over the country, but they are the #1 supplier of printed circuit boards to the Department of Defense, and this will only enhance their ability to deliver those critical technologies for important defense systems.
I'm sure it's just coincidental, but I did note that you were, pounding the pavement in Washington, D.C. here recently. So,
You
uh,
know, I'm glad you mentioned it because as much as we are celebrating awards like today's, and of course we've seen awards also to companies like Calumet and Green Source, also PCBAA members, the first thing that was accomplished not 3 years ago now was the invocation of the Defense Production Act. We have to have the government saying this is a critical technology before the Pentagon can then go and spend money and make investments. What we have seen every year is a fight on Capitol Hill. We have to get the Senate Appropriations Committee, the House Appropriations Committee, we have to get those dollars allocated every single year. And for FY23, for FY24, and now into FY25, the fight is joined. And with our partners at IPC, we have continued to go to the Hill and say, look, it really does matter, first, that you fund the DPA account specifically for microelectronics and as a subset of that, printed circuit boards, and then that you execute and actually spend those funds. That's why today's announcement is so great. I think you have to go back to November of December of 2023 to see the awards that I mentioned earlier, but they're getting funded and they're getting the money out the door. Every year, of course, though, we've got to go up and we've got to make sure that lawmakers are directing the Pentagon accordingly and funding the Pentagon accordingly. We still don't have fiscal year 25 appropriations. I don't know if that's going to happen in the lame duck later this year or if it will stretch into some sort of omnibus bill at the beginning of the next year before the new Congress sits down. But we still don't know what the number is going to be for FY25. And then we'll start all over again with those appropriations bills as we look forward to fiscal year 2026. We will be there fighting for these funds because today's announcement is an example of where the rubber meets the road.
And you made the point last time we spoke, if I remember correctly, that the important thing, you may not get everything you asked for, but you're getting something. And that's the important piece, right? That you, because when they go back, they're looking, did you get something before? Did you use it? Right. And if the answer is no, well, why give it to you now? Right. So isn't there a building of momentum there?
Yeah, and I think that we know, I should say, that there is certainly a challenge at the Department of Defense where they're trying to invest across multiple sectors, right? They want to make sure there's a base of critical minerals. They want to make sure there's a base of refined materials, any number of microelectronics components. They need to say, do we have this for the systems that, quite frankly, bring our fighting men and women home alive? It's not just PCBs. We acknowledge that. But of course, it's a critical component. It's sometimes overlooked. Certainly, I would say, in comparison to the love and attention that our friends in the semiconductor space have gotten over the last 5 or 6 years. So, this is why we exist, right? To work with the folks on the Hill who allocate the funds and direct the Department of Defense, and the folks inside the five-sided building who have to recognize the needs and give out these awards. We don't mind being a partner, right? It's an educate, advocate, and legislate mission here at PCBAA. Today's awards, I think, are a real testament to all the people we have on our team pushing, rowing, if you will, in the same direction.
Yeah. And that's why I saw that, was it 2 weeks ago that you and the team, you were all in DC pounding the pavement, shaking, making the point there, right? But I want to say too, I've noticed on the LinkedIn too, what I like to see that your member companies are also in their home states, having the congressmen, women coming into the facility,
Sure.
seeing the business that it is. Because I think that, rather than, I know you carry around a sample with you, but when you go in of a board, but seeing this real time and seeing the impact in their own congressional districts, that's important too.
There's no shortage for a tour of a PCB facility and to see the actual manufacturing happen on the ground. And you're right, during the August recess, we had visits in California, we had visits in Virginia, in Utah, in Massachusetts. And I am always thrilled when our members will open their doors to policymakers and say, come in and not just see the product and what a complicated process it is to bring a printed circuit board to life, but meet the people behind that product, meet the highly skilled workers who are, again, keeping planes in the sky, keeping ships at sea, any number of applications, not just in national security, but in aerospace and defense and the commercial sector. They're very proud of the work that what they do. They're eager to show policymakers. And for many lawmakers, Eric, for many people who decide the fate, right, of industrial policy, this is the first time that they've walked through a PCB factory, and they're learning about this complicated piece of technology that we invented here in the United States, that we largely offshored, and that we're trying to recapture as a source of industrial pride.
Yeah. It strikes me too with the work that you do as an advocate there in Washington, D.C. We're also heading into the election season, right? There will be some changes, like it or not, or whatever. And that could be congressional people that you've been building relationships may not be there come January, right? It may be somebody else come in. So you have to almost start all over again, don't you?
We do. I think that you're going to see some of our primary champions, the co-sponsors of HR 3249, probably will return in the House of Representatives. We're going to see some changes in the Senate. I'm very sorry to see Representative Anna Eshoo from California retire. She was one of the first original co-sponsors, along with Representative Blake Moore, of the PCBs Act. We're going to have other lawmakers step up and fill that gap. And every month we're signing up new co-sponsors on both sides of the aisle. And I think it's indicative of how compelling the story is when you go in and say, we've put $52 billion into semiconductors. We haven't invested really any substantive monies via the Department of Commerce into the industrial base that makes boards and substrates, and chips don't float. All of those semiconductors that we're going to make in places like Illinois, in places like Ohio, in places like New York, Texas, California, Arizona, they are not going to be mated up with an American stack, right? An American substrate, an American board, unless we make similar investments. So yes, we're going to see some change after the election. That is certainly the norm every 2 years in Washington. But what is not going to change is the idea that industrial policy is a good thing for the United States. What is not going to change is the fact that we're in global competition with other countries to own certain industrial sectors. What is not going to change is that other governments are acting. It's not just subsidies that you see from Asian countries, the Europeans, countries in South America, countries across the Caribbean. They're all in sort of a gold rush now for microelectronics manufacturing because they see that people don't want to be reliant on just one region of the world. So this is a global competition. I think in many ways we're playing catch up on
Mm-hmm.
industrial policy, not leading. And it's going to be incumbent on whoever is in power to act, and I think act swiftly.
Yeah. Excuse me. So considering it's the election season and the silly season, as Reagan called it, right? Um, is there any expectation for any activity still in fourth quarter? Today's the first day of the fourth quarter, right? What could we expect?
Well, I think, lawmakers have already gone home. There is some discussion that they may come back for a special session to address the terrible damage from the hurricanes in states like North Carolina. But other than disaster relief, I don't expect that this Congress will do very much before the election. When the lame duck comes back, it will be about that appropriations process that I discussed. We fully anticipate that the PCBs Act will be reintroduced again in the next Congress, perhaps with some revisions. We have to look at the amount of money. We have to look at the specific language and the tax breaks that have been proposed, sign up additional lawmakers. I would remind all of your listeners that it took almost 5 years for the CHIPS Act, backed by some of the biggest companies in the world, to actually become law. That was an iterative process. We went through a lot of evolutions. At one point, I think the CHIPS Act was more than $252 billion in funding. We settled on $52 billion enacted. So this is an evolution. The bill continues to grow and mature as we go forward. But to get back to your original question, I don't think we're going to see a lot of legislative activity on industrial policy through the remainder of the year. That doesn't mean that we won't continue to go into offices and say, hey, the next Congress is only a few months away. Let's get you on our team. Let's get you smart about these issues. And of course, all the new lawmakers who come through the door, I want to greet them with a smiling face, with a printed circuit board, and explain who we are and why they should care about our issues.
No, that's excellent. And let's talk about the PCBs, kind of it's said that they're kind of still in the shadows, so to speak, right? I mean, and you mentioned, I think the CHIPS Act is a great comparison, right? You settled at 53, but then that attracted how much over $400 billion from private money from the industry into the United States, and that. So that was, I'm assuming you're hoping for kind of something similar on the board side.
I believe strongly that private money follows public action. When Wall Street, when the investment community sees Uncle Sam step up and say, I believe in this, it's not a coincidence, as you said, that I think north of $400 billion in private money has come off the sidelines for the domestic manufacturing of semiconductors. The private sector sees what the government is doing. They see that, the ultimate backer, the US government, is at the table, right? Voting with our tax dollars. Something similar happens in the rest of the microelectronics stack, and private money, which I think is now on the sidelines, which is unsure about the viability of domestic manufacturing, unsure about a demand signal. I think it does absolutely get in the game when the government acts first.
Okay. And so part of that, I know, when we've talked about this before, is kind of a CHIPS Act too, right? Kind of more focus on the PCB. I'm assuming that's still a goal. That's a hope that you hope to achieve.
We are very happy to see the actual legislative solutions travel on what we would call any legislative vehicle, which is to say we have our own standalone bill, of course. But if there's a larger tax bill, if there's a larger China competitiveness bill, if there's a CHIPS 2.0 bill, we would have an advantage here that we didn't have 5 or 6 years ago when the CHIPS Act moved forward. We will be at the table. There simply wasn't an organized effort on behalf of the rest of the stack to be included in the CHIPS Act. And Eric, you bring up a question that I get a lot on Capitol Hill. Why didn't we take care of you guys when we passed the CHIPS Act? And the answer is because we didn't exist. We didn't exist as an organized entity. Our voice really wasn't being articulated as part of the process. And whether it was SEMI or SIA or Intel, they were advocating for their interests. Mm-hmm. And I respect that. They were very successful in their efforts in many ways. I think we need to model what we do now after what they did then. but certainly any future, what we would call legislative vehicles that might carry our solutions to the president's desk, we're going to be there.
Yeah. It's funny as I hear you talk, I'm thinking about how much PCBs really are taken for granted, right? Or in just,
Yeah,
they're in the
absolutely.
shadows. I ran a quick turn proto here, and I remember we had customers would send us kits, right? And then they'd call, hey, why aren't you building our boards? You got all the parts. It's like we didn't get the PCB yet, right?
Right.
We need the PCB. So even people in the industry take it for granted.
Yeah, I sometimes use the analogy that we're trying to build a sandwich without the bread, right? We've put a lot of money into peanut butter and jelly, and all of a sudden we don't have lunch. And the answer is, well, it's an ecosystem approach. And we really need to make sure that we are investing in substrates, investing in boards. Of course, many of our members also represent tooling, specialty chemicals, raw and refined materials. Everybody in the ecosystem
Mhm.
wants to see a strong domestic manufacturing base, because if you're making copper foil, a strong TTM, a strong Calumet benefits you. And so we are trying to tell that ecosystem story, and it's reflected in our membership, Eric. We started with 5 board shops. Today, we're at almost 65 members across that whole manufacturing ecosystem, because people say, okay, the train is moving down the tracks for what comes after the CHIPS Act. I want to be on it. I want to make sure my component, my segment, my technology is represented.
Yeah, exactly. And you made the point with the chip. It takes time. It took what 20 plus years for all this to get overseas. Bringing it back is going to take some time too. But there is a critical need. But let's talk about the industries. There's the critical national defense,
Mhm.
obviously, but also within the critical infrastructure. And I think there's a lot of chatter lately about the vulnerabilities of some of our critical infrastructure, from the electric grid to the water systems and what have you. So those all, it's not just the defense, although defense is a huge piece of it. It's these other important systems that need to be protected as well.
Yeah, the ITAR regime exists obviously to make sure that national security and defense technologies are manufactured here in the United States and that they don't travel into adversarial regimes. However, when you talk about things that we ought to secure, things that ought to be taken care of, you don't have to look very far around the world to understand that the power grid, right, water and sanitation systems, commercial banking, medical devices, these are all networks and systems that might come into play in a conflict, kinetic or non-kinetic, as the folks in the community might say. We need to think similarly, I think, in the United States. We have been very careful to say that, if it goes on a fighting helicopter, if it goes into a Humvee, if it goes into a government computer system, we want to be very careful about where it comes from. Shouldn't we be equally cautious with the servers that power Wall Street, with
Mhm.
the technology that keeps hospitals up and running, with the technology that keeps the water flowing and the lights on? I would argue we should be equally careful about that. And we've talked to lawmakers more and more about how the vulnerabilities, the threats, they extend beyond things that are painted in camouflage to the rest of our lives.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And hopefully it won't take a bad situation to kind of to increase the awareness and motivate some action in those areas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excuse me. We were talking before too. It's not just about the boards over there, but then there's all the related componentry, and that's not within your ballywig, as they say, but that's an interesting one too. If the boards are being made here, but yet we're sourcing all the componentry from Asia, because that is still where all the vast majority of all the manufacturing happens. Does that open up the potentials for vulnerability? And I guess the answer is yes, which is why some areas, like I know India, is investing in or giving incentives for domestic component manufacturing there. I don't know if any of that is on the in the future here in the U.S. or not. So.
Every time the Department of Defense asks this question, I think it prompts 2 or 3 more questions. I give a lot of credit to Undersecretary or Assistant Secretary LaPlante, Dr. Taylor Calais, Molly Just Bear. We now have Carla Zapiri at the Pentagon. There's any number of Anthony DeStasio, the PCB executive agent, any number of responsible and veteran government, dignitaries, employees, officials, however you want to say it, who are taking this challenge very seriously. They're asking tough questions and they're prompting industry to move, and they have the attention of Congress. The Pentagon is forward thinking about this, right? They're trying to, win the next conflict before it happens. And they're trying to ensure that we have what we need and that our allies have what they need. And so these are not easy problems to solve. And to your point, They are problems that were sort of engineered, created over a 30-year time scale. We've been at this for not quite 3 years now. So it is a fight that, we're going to have to join for months and weeks and quite frankly, years to come, I think.
Yeah, no, I think so. Which is why I'm kind of, I like to hear the growth of the association, that you went from 5 to 65 or plus, companies now, that it's spanning the ecosystem. It's just not, just the PCB or the substrate guys anymore. So talk about that. Talk about how people can get involved and what you need.
Yeah, we have more political power when we have more um, manufacturing representation is the best way to say it, right? We're in 30 states right now, almost 65 members today. As you mentioned, everything from the raw materials coming out of the ground all the way to the assembled boards. I'm hopeful soon that that will include OEMs and prime contractors as well, really everybody in the ecosystem. But if you're sitting out there wondering how you can make your voice heard in Washington, how you can get action on industrial policy for any part of the ecosystem that is not semiconductors, because they are being taken care of with the CHIPS Act, I would say join our growing team, right? PCBAA.org. Find us on social media. Reach out to myself, our president, Will Marsh, our chairman, Shane Whiteside. Visit us at PCB West next week. I want to talk to you about what you're doing as part of the ecosystem. The learning curve for me, Eric, has just been incredible. Every week I meet a company that says, we do this part of the value chain, and the success of domestic PCB manufacturing, the emergence and success of domestic substrate manufacturing, that is critical to my bottom line, critical to my survival. So I'm learning a lot about, quite frankly, the hundreds of organizations that are a part of bringing products to market. And we think there's a place for all of them on our growing team.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And for those watching, PCB West, Santa Clara Convention Center next week, that's October 8th through 11th. And if I'm not mistaken, you're booth 213. So go
Please
see.
come say hello.
Yeah, he's very engaged. But also, I would encourage people to. I know that you put out a newsletter as well that people
Yep.
can sign up to receive, and that's good information. And also, I see you on the PCBAA and you on LinkedIn all the time. You guys are always giving good updates about your activities, what's happening in the congressional districts as well, with the companies being visited, and all of that is good information that speaks to the momentum that you're building. So that's all good stuff, and keep it up.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I get to speak to you again in 2024, David. I'll be on the road all of November, and then we hit the real silly season of the holidays, right? So in case listen, but if anything were to pop and happen, you just give a call and we'll get on as quickly as possible.
You wake up and you're really not sure what's going to happen on supply chains, on industrial policy, on political changes in our government. There's any number of things that break. We appreciate you shining a light on this segment of microelectronics and certainly bringing the information to your listeners. So yeah, if something pops off, let's find a way to connect. And if not, it's going to be a busy fourth quarter for everybody.
Yeah. Well, any final thoughts as we end the year for heading into 2020? You
I'm
can wish
just
everyone
really,
Merry Christmas.
here's what I would say, Eric. I'm really excited about our momentum. I don't think anybody, when 5 companies thought up the idea for this association 3 years ago, envisioned that we would be as big as we are, that we would have as many wins behind us legislatively, policy-wise as we already have, that so many people now can do something they couldn't do 3 years ago, which is they can look at a printed circuit board. They can understand that we make some of them here. We invented them. We need to make more of them, and that they make modern life possible. The more and more people in positions of power who have that realization, the closer we are to real industrial policy that benefits our members, your listeners. So I'm feeling great headed into 2025.
Good. Excellent. No, good work this year. I look forward to
Thank you.
continuing talking to you and getting more updates next year.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, David. Take good care.
Okay.